The flash flood warning had been howling out of the radio for 20 minutes, and every other rider on that search had already turned back for the trailhead, but a mile up the Rincon Rim, where the trail bent out over the black slot of Perdita Canyon, a chestnut gelding named Copper had set all 4 feet in the hard caliche and would not take one more step toward home. The sky upstream was the wrong colour for 6 o'clock in the evening, a bruised green-black wall standing over the high country where the monsoon had been dumping rain on bare rock for an hour, and the air coming down the canyon had gone cold and wet and smelled of turned earth, the smell the desert gives off right before it tries to kill you. Deputy Tessa Vaughan had both hands on the reins, and she was asking the horse to move the only way she knew how, legs and voice, and 40 pounds of lean, and the horse was not fighting her, not rearing, not bolting. Copper had simply dropped his weight back over his hocks and swung his big head out toward the rim, out over the drop into the canyon, and he was blowing hard through his nose and stamping one front foot against the stone in a way Tessa had felt maybe 3 times in the 4 years she had ridden him, and every one of those times it had meant the same thing. Something is wrong here, and I am not leaving it. Now, a horse cannot tell you what he knows. He cannot key a radio and call it in. All he can do is refuse, stake his whole £1,000 on it, and hope the person on his back has learned to read him. And Tessa Vaughan sat there on that rim with a flood coming down the throat of the canyon and a sergeant's voice on her radio calling her by name, ordering her off the trail before the water came, and she understood that she had about 1 minute to decide whether the machine on her chest was right or the horse under her was right, and that, if she chose wrong, the canyon was going to take somebody that night. If you have ever had to trust an animal against every sensible voice in your ear, including your own, then stay with me all the way to the end of this. Because what that horse knew, and what he refused to walk away from, with the water already rising in the wash below, is a thing the people in that county still talk about the way they talk about the storms that everyone remembers by name. To understand why Copper would set his feet on that rim and gamble both their lives on it, and why a careful, by-the-book deputy was about to disobey a direct order to stay beside a horse most people had wanted put down, you have to go back 4 years, to a muddy sale yard 200 miles south. Tessa Vaughan had gone to that auction for a different horse entirely, a quiet grey mare her sergeant had asked her to size up, and she was walking the back pens in the rain when she came on him, a big raw-boned chestnut jammed alone into the last pen against the fence, up to his fetlocks in mud, with a paper tag that said only dangerous, no ride, and a run number that meant one thing at a yard like that, which was that the only buyer left was the truck that hauled the leftovers to the plant. They told her his story in pieces, in the grudging manner of men handing you a thing they are half ashamed of. He had come off a hard-luck outfit that ran cattle in flood country down along the river, and the summer before, a hand had tried to push him across a swollen ford in the dark, and the crossing had gone wrong, the bottom dropping out from under them, and the horse had gone down in the current tangled in a downed fence, and fought his way out half drowned and cut to the bone, and he had never been right about water since. He would not cross a running creek or walk through a puddle he could not see the bottom of, and he had put 2 men in the dirt when they tried to force him, which was enough to write the word dangerous on his tag and back him into the last pen to wait for the truck. And Tessa Vaughan stood in the rain and looked at a horse that flinched when the water dripped off the barn roof behind him, and she did a thing she could never quite explain afterward, and never really tried to. She bought him for the price of his weight, the same price the truck would have paid, and she loaded him alone in the dark and brought him home. Her sergeant, a hard, decent man named Cole Bassett, who had run the mounted unit for 18 years, told her plainly that she had bought herself a heartbreak, that a horse ruined around water at that age does not come back, and that a search and rescue outfit had no earthly use for an animal that panicked at a puddle. And a well-known horseman named Webb Tanner, whose opinion carried weight for 200 miles in every direction, came out as a favour, stood at the rail a long while, and told her the kindest hard thing he knew, which was that some horses are broken in a place you cannot reach, and the merciful thing might be to let this one go. Tessa did not argue with either of them. She just went out to the round pen every morning before her shift and every evening after, and for the better part of a year she did not once ask that horse to cross water. She asked him for nothing but to stand near her and be safe, the way you sit with anyone who has been down in the dark and cannot yet believe the ground will hold. If you have ever refused to give up on something that everyone with good sense told you to let go of, do me one small favour and tap that subscribe button now. Because this channel is built by and for the people who stay, and there are more of us out here than the world lets on. Bringing a horse back to water is not a thing you do with force, and Tessa Vaughan was not fool enough to try. She did it with a garden hose left running in the round pen until the trickle of it was just part of the world, and by walking him, month after month, to the edge of the shallow stock tank and letting him drink and turn away, until the day he set one foot into it on his own to reach a patch of shade. And she near about cried in the saddle over one hoof in 8 inches of water. By the second year, something had turned in him that surprised even her, because a horse that has nearly died in moving water does not forget it, and Copper never did forget it. But instead of the fear leaving him useless, it had made him careful. He read water the way other horses read the ground for gopher holes, stopping at the lip of a wash to test the footing and the current with a caution no trainer had ever put in him, because the river itself had taught him, and the lesson had cost him nearly everything. When she finally certified him for the unit, Cole Bassett watched Copper pick a flooded crossing apart step by patient step, and said, half to himself, that he had never in his life seen a horse mind water like that one did. In the years that followed, Copper carried Tessa Vaughan into country that eats other horses. He stood belly deep and dead steady in the Salado wash at flood stage while she pulled a stranded rafter off a snag by the collar, a crossing 2 younger, better-bred horses had already flat refused. And once, on a winter search, he had stopped cold on a trail and would not go on, and Tessa had learned enough by then to get down and look, and she found an old man who had wandered off from a campground, sitting against a rock 40 feet below the trail, where no one walking it would ever have seen him. She had learned to trust the horse's refusal the way you trust a smoke detector in the night. It was not stubbornness, it was the truest thing he had to give her, and it had never once been wrong. The young woman's name was Hannah Reese, and she was 23 years old, and she had been missing for 2 days by the evening the storm changed everything. She had driven up alone on a Thursday to backpack the Perdita Loop, a hard, lonesome stretch of canyon country she had hiked a dozen times, and she had texted her sister a photo from the rim that first night, a grinning selfie with the whole Gold Canyon falling away behind her, and then nothing. When she did not come home, and did not answer, and did not post, her sister called the sheriff, and a deputy found Hannah's little car still sitting at the trailhead with a parking pass on the dash, and a fleece folded on the seat, and that was when the whole county's stomach dropped. Because a car left at a trailhead on the second day is the worst thing a searcher can find. They put everything they had on that canyon. 40 volunteers walking the loop trail in teams, a dog team on the switchbacks, a helicopter out of the city flying the rim with a spotter in the open door. All the machinery a small county throws at one of its own when the clock is running. And they found the same nothing that big searches so often find, because Perdita Canyon is a maze of side drainages and slot cuts and undercut ledges, and a person who has fallen and cannot climb and cannot shout does not turn up on a loop trail no matter how many boots walk it. They were still finding nothing but a single trekking pole wedged in a crack at the head of a side canyon when the sky went green over the high country and the weather service put a flash flood warning on the whole drainage, and the man running the search did the cold arithmetic the desert forces on the people who work it. His name on that operation was Cole Bassett, and the call he had to make that evening was the kind that takes a piece out of a man and does not give it back. A flash flood in a slot canyon does not rise the way a lake rises, it arrives. A wall of brown water and boulders and whole cottonwood trees coming down the wash at the speed of a running truck, and it does not care how many good people are standing in the bottom of that canyon looking for a girl. He had 40 searchers strung out through a drainage that was about to fill, one road out, and a wall of water already building on bare rock upstream, and so he suspended the search and ordered every soul up onto the rim road that instant. No exceptions. And back at the trailhead, somebody had to walk over to a woman who had driven 300 miles to wait for her little sister and tell her that they were pulling out, that the water was coming, that they were so terribly sorry. Hannah's sister did not scream. She only asked, in a voice gone very quiet, whether pulling out meant they were leaving Hannah down in that canyon for the flood to find first, and not one person standing there could put a single word in the air to give her back. Tessa Vaughn should have been climbing to the rim road with everyone else. She had worked the high-side drainages with copper all that second day until the first fat drops of rain began to fall, and had come back to the staging area wire tight and sick over a search she could not fix. And when the order to pull out came down, she did a thing that 4 years on the unit had earned her the standing to do. She went to Cole Bassett with her map, and she put one finger on the Rincon Rim, a spine of trail above the deepest part of the canyon that the ground teams had walked but the horse had never worked. High ground the flood could not reach even at its worst, and she asked him for 15 minutes. Just her and the gelding, out of the water, before that whole shoulder of the canyon was cut off by the dark and the flood. She told him what he already knew, that Copper would catch what 40 pairs of boots had walked straight past, that a hurt person gone quiet in the rocks could sit 30 feet off a trail and never be found by eyes alone, and that she was not asking to play the hero. Cole Bassett looked at her a long moment. Then he looked at the sky. And against 18 years of doing this work the careful way, he keyed his radio and told the rim team to hold one truck and one trailer at the Rincon pull-off. And he told Tessa she had until the wash below her started to run and not 1 second past it, and that when he called her, she would come, or it would be the last ride she ever took in his unit. She said yes. She was already swinging up into the saddle. So a mounted deputy and a once-condemned chestnut gelding rode out alone on the Rincon Rim in the last grey light of a bad evening, the canyon going dark below them and the storm rolling down out of the high country. They had gone maybe half a mile along the rim when Copper's head came up and his ears locked forward, and he slowed under her without being asked. And then, at the place where the trail bent out toward the drop, he set his feet in the caliche and would not go on. Tessa asked him forward, and he would not. She asked him to turn back toward the truck, and he would not do that either, and that was the thing that stood the hair up along her arms, because in 4 years the horse had refused to go forward plenty of times, but he had never once refused to go home. He swung that big head out over the black slot of the canyon, and he stamped and blew, and Tessa Vaughn understood that she was being told 2 different things at once by an animal who had no other way to say either of them. If your chest is tight right now, if you already know in your gut what that horse was standing guard over, do me one small favour and leave a single word in the comments, anything at all, so I know you rode this far with them. because everything this story is for happens in the next few minutes. She got down, looped the reins over the horn, and went to the rim on foot, and she lay flat on the wet stone at the edge the way you do when a drop will kill you, and put her light down into the canyon. The beam swam through the rain and found ledges and undercuts and the pale ribbon of the dry wash far below. And she had almost pulled it back when something small and out of place caught at the very edge of the light, 30 feet down and off to the side, on a broad shelf of rock above the wash. A patch of blue that was not stone. She steadied the beam on it, and it moved. It lifted, slow and stiff, into the shape of an arm, and a face turned up into her light out of the dark, grey and cracked and hollowed out by 2 days on bare rock, and a voice came up the wall so thin the wind almost took it. The voice of a person who had stopped calling for help a full day before, because calling had brought no one. And it said one word. Here, getting down to Hannah Reese was the easy part, a scramble down a break in the ledges that a hurt and weakening woman could never have climbed back up. She was alive, dehydrated to the ragged edge of it, her right ankle swollen tight as a melon and useless under her. Hypothermic from 2 nights of canyon cold and now soaked through by the rain, but alive, her pulse going fast and light under Tessa's fingers. She had fallen the first evening chasing a photograph too far out a side ledge, had screamed herself voiceless and unheard against the walls, and had crawled at last onto the widest shelf she could find to wait. And here was the terrible arithmetic of that shelf, the thing that turned the next few minutes into the longest of Tessa Vaughan's life, because as she worked a strap under Hannah's arms, she felt the stone beneath them both begin to change. Under the roar of the rain, there was a new sound now, a deep grinding rumble coming down the canyon out of the high country, the sound the desert makes when a flash flood is coming down a wash toward you, and the wash that Hannah's shelf sat above, the dry gravel floor that was the only way out on foot, had maybe 10 minutes left before it became a river. There was no litter, no team, no rope crew, no second set of hands. There was one deputy, one hurt woman who could not walk, one horse, and a wall of water coming down a canyon that did not care about any of them. The only way out that did not run through the wash was back up the break in the ledges to the rim, 30 vertical feet of wet rock in the dark, and Tessa Vaughan could not carry a grown woman up it alone. So she did the only thing left. She whistled Copper down off the rim to the head of the break, onto footing that would have sent any sane horse scrambling backward, and the big chestnut came, picking every single step, and she got Hannah Reese belly down over the saddle the way she had once been taught to move a body that could not sit, and she took the reins at his head and started up. And Copper, the horse 2 men had written off as too broken to trust near water, leaned into that climb with the flood already roaring at the mouth of the canyon behind him, and he did not panic, and he did not bolt, and he did not put a single foot wrong, because he, of all the horses in that county, knew exactly what was coming down that wash, knew it in the old scars under the saddle, and he had decided long ago, and at a terrible price, that he was never going to let the water win again. Some things a creature can only learn by nearly dying of them, and once it has, it will never lie to you about the water again. They came up over the lip of the rim into the truck's headlights, with the flood going off like a freight train below. And there were hands then, other people's hands, lifting Hannah down, and Tessa Vaughan stood in the rain, with both arms around the wet neck of a horse the truck would have taken 4 years before, and she could not have told you which of the 2 of them was shaking harder. Hannah Reese lived. They got fluids and heat into her in the truck, and the helicopter that could not fly the canyon in the storm met them on the rim road at first light, and by the time her sister reached the hospital, Hannah was in a warm bed with her ankle pinned and splintered, wrung out, and 2 days from the worst of it, but alive enough on the second morning to ask a nurse in a cracked whisper whether the horse was all right. And in the days after, as the flood drained out of the canyon, people began to understand exactly what Copper had done up on that rim. And the understanding of it is the part that still stops Tessa Vaughn in the middle of a sentence, even now. Because when the searchers walked the bottom of the canyon after the water went down, they found the shelf where Hannah had sheltered, and they found that the flood had come up the wash that night higher than anyone in the county had seen it in 20 years, and it had washed clean over the lower ledges and the break in the rock, over the exact ground a rescuer on foot would have had to cross to reach her and climb back out. If Tessa Vaughn had gone down into that canyon from below, as a ground team would have gone, as every instinct that was not sitting on that horse's back had been telling her to go, the water would have caught them both in the wash, and there would have been 2 more names in the paper instead of a rescue. Copper had refused to go forward on the rim because he had caught the scent of the hurt woman 30 feet below him in the dark, and he had refused to go home, refused to leave that spot even for the safety of the waiting truck. Because he had already heard it or felt it or smelled it, the thing coming down the canyon that no person up there could yet sense. The same wall of water that had nearly killed him in another canyon in another year, and he was not going to let her walk down into it. A scientist would tell you it was scent and hearing and a good animal's nerves, that a horse does not understand a flood or remember what water once did to him. Maybe that is all it was, but Tessa Vaughn will tell you, if you ask her, that of every horse in that whole county, the one who stood between a woman and a flood in the dark and would not be moved was the one the water had already tried once to take, and failed. The vindication of Copper, if you want to call it that, did not come from Tessa. She never once told the story as anything but the horses. It came instead from the 2 men who had counted him out. Cole Bassett, the sergeant who had told her 4 years earlier that she had bought a heartbreak, and who had then granted her 15 minutes and ordered her out, stood up at the county supervisor's meeting called to recognise the search, and said a thing that men who run rescue units almost never say out loud. He said that he had been wrong twice about the same horse. He said that by every rule of good sense he had run the operation right, and that if it had been left to his maps and his radio and his careful arithmetic, there would have been no rider on that rim at all, and that girl would have gone down the wash with the cottonwood trees, and that a horse he had once advised her to send to the truck had known more about that canyon than the whole of his command. And old Webb Tanner, the horseman who had gently told her to let the broken thing go, drove out to her place the next week and did not say much, because his kind never does. But he walked up to the chestnut gelding at the fence, stood with him a good while, and then took off his hat, an old man taking his hat off to a horse, and said that in 50 years of horses he had never been so glad to have been so wrong, and asked her, quiet, whether he might put that gelding's name up for the state's animal service commendation. She said yes. Hannah Reese came out to Tessa Vaughn's place a month later, walking on a cane and a mending ankle, and she did the thing that people who have been pulled back from the edge always come to do, which is to stand in front of the animal that did it and try to find a way to say the unsayable. She had brought a sack of carrots and fed them to Copper one at a time from her flat, shaking hand, and the big gelding licked them up with the enormous gentleness of a horse who has always known how careful to be, and Hannah pressed her forehead to the broad flat of his cheek and stood there a long time without saying anything at all. Because what is there to say? And Tessa, who understood, told Hannah the only thing worth telling, which was that the debt was not hers to carry, not to the deputy, and not even to the horse, that all any of them owed now was to go and live a big, loud, ordinary life out in the daylight, the kind of life a hurt girl had crawled onto a cold shelf of rock and refused to stop reaching for, and that to spend it on guilt would be the one true way to waste what the horse had given. Copper is older now. There is grey coming in over his eyes and along his jaw, and he is stiff on the cold mornings, and the unit has eased him back to the shallow crossings and the shorter rides. He does not seem to grieve the hard work as Tessa feared he might. On most days, he is content to graze the pasture behind her place and doze in the shade of the run-in shed and lift his grey head at the sound of her truck in the drive, to be, after a whole life spent walking into the water for other people, a horse who no longer has to walk into anything at all. But every so often, in the deep of the monsoon season, when the sky goes green over the high country and the first far grumble of thunder rolls down the valley, Tessa will find him standing at the fence line with his head up and his ears forward and his whole old body turned toward the canyons, reading something on the wet wind that no person alive can read, and she does not call him in. She goes out and stands beside him with a hand flat on his warm shoulder, and the two of them face the storm together, the deputy and the horse who came up out of the water once and then spent his whole life standing between it and everyone else. There is a photograph that ran in the county paper that fall, and if you saw it, you would understand this whole story in a single look. It shows a young woman, healthy now, brown and laughing, standing at a pasture fence with her arm thrown over the neck of a greying chestnut horse. And the horse has turned his big head in against her, the way he once leaned his whole weight into a climb up out of a canyon. And neither one of them is looking at the camera. They are looking at each other. Hannah Reese hikes again, carefully and never alone, and she has told Tessa more than once that when she is settled, she means to volunteer with the county's mounted search unit. And to start, she says, with the horse that nobody else wants, because the one everybody has already given up on, she has learned, is very often the one that has learned the most worth knowing. If you rode all the way to the end of this one, thank you for staying up on that rim with them. Because stories like this only travel as far as the people who choose to carry them on, and somewhere out there tonight is a person who has been written off, backed into the last pen, marked too broken to be worth the trouble, who needs to hear that the very thing that nearly destroyed them might one day be the thing that lets them save somebody else. So let me leave you with something to hold before you go. When you think of copper on that dark rim, is it the courage that stays with you, the choice to stand into a flood in the dark for a woman he had never once met? Or is it the memory, the old wound that let him feel the water coming when no one else could? The thing that turned the worst night of his life into the reason he could give somebody else a morning. Hold on to whichever one is yours, and then tell me in the comments what corner of the world you are listening from tonight, because I like to picture all the porches and kitchens and long dark drives this story is riding out to reach. There will be another one next week, another trail, another animal, another soul carried home by a creature that simply would not quit. And out behind a small house at the edge of the canyon country, in the green quiet before a monsoon evening, an old chestnut horse stands at the fence with his grey face lifted toward the high country, holding still, listening to something only he can hear, before he lowers his head at last and steps back to the woman who bought him for the price of the truck and never once let the water have him.